Welcome to the first installment of our year-long discussion series on advancing health and social justice. My name is Stephen Swartzer, and I am the Associate Director for Academic Programs in Fordham University's Center for Ethics Education. The Center for Ethics Education, which is directed by Dr. Celia Fisher, was established in 1999 as an interdisciplinary cross-campus unit at Fordham. The Ethics Center embodies Fordham's commitment to intellectual excellence, social justice, and human dignity through the promotion of ethics education, research, and public dialogue. Our programs include an interdisciplinary master's degree program in ethics and society, an advanced graduate certificate program in healthcare ethics, the HIV and Drug Abuse Prevention Research Ethics Training Institute, or READY, that has provided a significant amount of support for our series, and an undergraduate bioethics minor. In addition to these programs, we're also really excited to have public-facing and social justice programming that engages people in conversation about issues of contemporary social import. And so that brings us to today's conversation about social justice and higher education. Before I introduce our participants, I wanted to say a little bit about the procedure for this session for everybody. So for the first part of the discussion, we will have the panelists tell us a little bit about their work and how it connects up to this topic. And then we'll have a conversation between them. And we do hope that everybody in the audience, is part of this conversation. And we're excited to include questions and contributions from all of you. For tonight's discussion, we've decided to use the private chat feature for the audience questions. So to submit your question, please submit it as a private chat to me, and then I will ask it on behalf of you. And please do so at any point during the conversation. So I will try to be monitoring the chat there. Now, with no further ado, our two panelists for this evening. Dr. Lionel McPherson is an associate professor of philosophy at Tufts University, where he is also the co-director of Tufts Certificate Program in Ethics, Law, and Society. Professor McPherson received an AB in philosophy from Princeton University and a PhD from Harvard University, and was a faculty fellow at Harvard Center for Ethics and the Professions. His research covers a range of topics in ethics and social political philosophy, including moral theory, war and terrorism, the philosophy of race, white supremacy, global justice, and education. Our second panelist is Dr. Sherry Wang, who is an associate professor in the counseling psychology department at Santa Clara University, where she supervises the Health and Ethnic Racial Disparities, or HERD, research ethics team, or research team. She is also a visiting professor fellow at the Center for AIDS Prevention at the University of California, San Francisco, and the chair of the American Psychological Association's Committee on Ethnic Minority Affairs. Professor Wang received her BA in psychology from Smith College and an MA and PhD in psychology from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. She completed her doctoral internship at the University of Illinois Chicago Counseling Center and was previously an assistant professor at the University of Southern Mississippi. So we're really excited to have both of you here today to contribute your understanding about this really important topic. And so now I will jump right in, and Professor McPherson, could you please take it away?
Thanks for having me. I'm afraid maybe what I will say could be seen as being provocative, or I'm not trying to be provocative. I would say that one of the morals of the story I'm going to tell right now, which is largely shaped by my the work I've done in my forthcoming book, The Afterlife of Race. I think even thinking about these things the way I'm thinking about them seems provocative, and I think that itself is illustrates a pretty serious problem and a lot of confusion. So let me get to it, but I just wanted to issue that disclaimer. So I was a little bit confused sometimes, like, well, what the topic is. So sometimes it's social justice and higher education, but then sometimes it's racial justice. So I'm going to speak on whatever the racial justice thing is supposed to be, and I'm going to start by saying, now that I got my disclaimers out of the way, I'm not really sure what racial justice is supposed to mean. And that's partly because, and I'm not trying to be clever about this either. Sometimes people think I'm like, like trying to be funny or clever or something. There's nothing funny or clever about what I'm talking about. But also, I'm not sure what race is supposed to mean. And what I find more surprising, the more I've thought about it, and I've been thinking about it for a long time and writing more intensely about it, especially over the last 10 years, I get the sense that other people don't know what they mean either. Or they might have some sense of what they mean, kind of, inchoate sense, but we can't be sure and short what each other means. And so racial justice just sort of makes that problem, I think, it makes it more immediately practical. So what's my problem? My problem is, why am I skeptical about the very notion of quote unquote racial justice? Well, it's too vague, and worse, I believe, and I believe I've shown, it functions to obscure fundamentally different kinds of justice claims and their urgency. So it suggests that there is like a singular type of phenomenon, or at least a singular phenomenon in a certain place in time, let's say the United States circa 2020, and nothing could be further from the truth. So I will be proceeding right now as if, since I believe this to be true, as if Black American justice claims are fundamental, urgent, and freestanding. And it's perfectly reasonable and appropriate, to say the least, to articulate them, even in the absence, might say, of largely fictitious, or gestures to non-specific, largely fictitious coalitions, like so-called Black and Brown, right? I'm not sure what the Brown is doing there. I'm not sure why that's supposed to be particularly important. I'm not sure what phenomenon that's supposed to be tracking with regard to racial justice, but I believe that what's going on is what I call an example of counter-progressive politics. So let me give, for purposes of illustration, because the same problem arises even when it comes to what's supposed to be the same racial group, even though, again, I'm not exactly sure what a racial group is supposed to be. Now, when I say this, that's not supposed to be confused with sort of like my adopting some sort of colorblind sensibility or politics. In fact, what I'm talking about is extremely color conscious. It's just color conscious with regard to social political lineage, not with regard to some largely mysterious, misleading, and sometimes irrelevant race thing. So consider the controversy. It's still ongoing. It's been going on for, I've been aware, it's been going on for more than 30 years now. And it seems to be, people are no clear about what it's really about, whether they capitalize the B in Black. And I take it that's a conversation that's had in the United States. And white liberals seem to be inclined to capitalize it. And apparently, quite a few Black American social activist types think it's important to capitalize it. Not only do they think it's important to capitalize the B in Black, but they oftentimes feel very awkward about capitalizing the W in white. And by white, I would mean white American. Okay, versus white, just full stop, lowercase w, right? And that could mean anybody, including people in Scandinavia. Who knows where they are? Hungary. I mean, people that have nothing to do really with the United States. So in the context of the United States, I think it's highly misleading to talk in these more broad, universalistic race type terms. Like we're talking about Blacks as such, whoever they're supposed to be. I have an easy answer to that. Or whites as such, whoever and wherever they're supposed to be. And to cast these issues of justice in racial terms, when in fact, most urgently and of greatest priority are the more local politics and dynamics, color conscious dynamics in politics. So concretely, for example, I would say lowercase b, you might say that refers to Blacks, and who are the Blacks, right? We don't really have any very clear criteria, other than that we know that they have, genealogically traceable African ancestry, and they typically, so to speak, look like they do. That's to say, they're seen as typically looking Black, right? Even though there's a wide spectrum of what counts as looking Black in a place like the United States, to some extent Brazil as well, that's a little bit more complicated a case, but it's version of the same thing. And in the New World generally, because of the prevalence of forced reproductive mixing between white men and Black enslaved women. So if we talk about Black, are we talking about all Africa identified peoples, whoever and wherever they are? Or are we talking in more specific local context about a group that was treated as Black, persons were treated as, they were Africa identified? And in the context of the United States historically, again, there's no theory behind this, it's a simple fact of history. The Blacks that we're talking about are descendants of American slavery. There were no other Blacks. And let me be clear, there was nobody else. There were no immigrant Blacks. Slaves were not immigrants. So it's highly misleading and confusing to talk about, let's say, race-conscious affirmative action. Weakly though it's practiced now, it's still some kind of thing, right? And as it turns out, the race-conscious affirmative action does not pay attention to social political lineage all that much, because it's not tracking who's a descendant of American slavery versus whoever is being counted or counts themselves as Black on whatever basis, wherever they're from. They might well be Africa-identified persons, right? But you might say, well, what do Africa-identified persons who grew up in Ghana, for example, just an example, or Nigeria, just an example. The relevant examples, because those are Atlantic African countries, and that's where descendants of American slavery, that is the African component of their ancestry, came from. Go, well, what do they have to do with so-called racial justice and its history in the United States? I mean, I won't go into what they have to do with it, but whatever they might have had to do with it didn't have anything to do with what was actually happening in the United States. They might have had something to do with what was happening in Africa, but nothing with what was happening in the United States. So how is their being so-called Black, that is Africa identified, supposed to be relevant to thinking about so-called racial justice in the United States? So for example, with regard to socioeconomic position or disposition to be subject to mass incarceration, or before that lynching, or systematic legal discrimination in the workforce and in neighborhoods, and basically everything that's been the history of Black Americans as descendants of American slavery in this country, and is the source, the overwhelming source of their socioeconomic disadvantage, namely disadvantage as a bottom caste group. So what's that about? So what I want to say is, thinking in terms of race, one, we don't know exactly what that's supposed to be. We don't know exactly why that's supposed to matter. It matters obviously in different places in very different ways. Presumably it matters hardly not at all, at least the Black part, if you're in Nigeria, because everybody there for the most part is so-called Black. So that distinction isn't going to make much of a difference. What would make a difference would be, for example, you're from the slave caste. Oh, you're not just from the slave caste, you're from the American slave caste. Oh, you're American, right? Your family is born and raised in the United States. They were descendants of American slavery. And so pointing this out isn't supposed to be divisive. It's not, it's just a statement of fact, any more than pointing out that just because Ashkenazi Jews are Europeans, they're not white in the way that non-Jewish Europeans are white. And we have a perfectly clear historical idea of why this is, and it's undeniably true, and it had severe ramifications. So if we just put it in racial terms, even though sometimes people try to characterize Jews as a race, I mean, Ashkenazi Jews are European Jews. Europeans are supposed to be white. But obviously that didn't make a critical difference to their treatment in Nazi Germany in World War II. So I think, in short, thinking in terms of race and also thinking in terms of racial justice can be highly misleading. It's too non-specific. It doesn't put us in a very good position to understand exactly what the problem is. So it doesn't put us in a very good position to understand, well, what kind of remedies, if we're looking for remedies at all, would be most appropriate, practically speaking, and also on grounds of priority. So that's sort of the background. So when I say capital B, I think the capital B in Black, insofar as it designates something like an ethnic group, right, or a social political lineage, is speaking out specifically in the context of the United States. Might say lowercase Blacks, who are, that is, Africa identified persons, who are descendants of American slavery, and whose social political lineage has been entirely in the United States. I say that because there are a couple of tricky cases where you have descendants of American slavery who ended up immigrating to Liberia. And so there's a break, even though they're actually, they're descendants of American slavery, they've been in Liberia, family's been in Liberia for the past, let's say, 150 or so years. So that's a kind of wrinkle. So the capital B designates that. It's not a vague, non-specific honorific. There's no reason that Africa identified persons, wherever they're from, whatever their histories are, need to be capitalized. We don't need that honor. The capital B designates specifically Black Americans as descendants of American slavery. And similarly, I would say that I would capitalize the white because that designates white Americans. Those who are, or those who eventually become accepted as full-fledged first-class white American citizens, right? Which hasn't been the case generally for later white immigrant groups. There was also a hierarchy among Europeans. So Italians weren't full-fledged on arrival, at least some of them were. Irish weren't full-fledged on arrival. Obviously, Jews weren't full-fledged on arrival. As the late historian Noel Ignatieff said, right, their whiteness wasn't taken for granted. In that sense, they had to earn it. And they earn it by basically being assimilated to the racial caste system that operates in the United States, with Black Americans as a bottom caste group. So I would go further now, and this is, I hope what I have said hasn't been too controversial, but maybe it has been. But I mentioned before this idea of counter-progressive politics, or right now I say counter-progressive racial politics. And I think that's what concerns me most about this general talk, including in higher education, about racial justice or diversity, equity, and inclusion stuff. Because I'm like, well, what's the basis? What's the justice claim? The justice claims are going to be very different. Hispanic isn't even a thing. I mean, it's not a freestanding thing. It was a thing that was created in like 1972 by the Nixon administration to create a racial type group, even though of course Hispanic isn't a race at all. It cuts across race. So what kind of justice claim is going on there, right? That doesn't mean that Puerto Ricans don't have certain justice claims. That doesn't mean that Mexican Americans don't have certain justice claims. But those justice claims are going to be historically embedded about the circumstances of those people, not on account of race in general, not on account of Blackness or brownness, whatever exactly that's supposed to consist in. It's going to have to do more specifically, just like we say Japanese justice claims with regard to reparations, use that word, for internment during World War II. Obviously unjust, and it was believed that apology wasn't sufficient, that material remedy was also called for. That's not just something that happens under a broad category of racial justice. That's a specific kind of justice claim and a specific kind of remedy that targeted a specific national immigrant group, in this case, Japanese Americans. So it seems to me to deny these realities that are readily accepted and taken for granted in other cases, to deny them when it comes to the case of Black Americans as descendants of American slavery, is a kind of, whether it's intentional or not, operates to me as a kind of progressive, counter-progressive racial caste politics. Because what ends up happening in effect is Black American claims don't have the same kind of freestanding status or the kind of urgency they would otherwise have, because they're basically being assimilated to all of these other so-called racial justice claims, even though it's oftentimes not clear what those claims are about or what they'd be about now. So I hope that gives some general view of where I'm coming from. So with regard sort of the background, I don't think it's a theory. I just think it's a reading and interpretation of basically everything going on in race in every field. I kid you not, it's in part one of my forthcoming book, but it shows up in the science, and it shows up in the proto-science, and it shows up in the theology, and it shows up in the anthropology and psychology and sociology. It's all over the place. And it's really about specific, and it shows up also, and maybe most importantly, or obviously, in Supreme Court rulings, where it's clear the Supreme Court was explicitly making racial caste rulings. And it was clear that they were talking about a white racial caste and a Black racial caste. Native Americans were a category unto themselves, as were later non-white immigrant groups. And there's what people would call as racism, as bigotry and xenophobia. That's just an American thing. It's happening with all groups all the time, including so-called white groups or Europeans. But still, what that really amounts to in fuller context is very different. And it's important, I think, to pay attention to those differences. And it's deeply objectionable to not pay attention to those differences on grounds of some very non-specific, general, aspirational diversity, equity, and inclusion mission. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. I wanted to remind now the audience members that if you have any questions at any point, please do submit those to the chat to me. And now we will have Dr. Wang go.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. I'm super excited to see your faces, even from a distance. That's if there had to be, right, some kind of silver lining with, COVID, it would be that we get to cross the distance in this way to be able to connect. So I actually have a bit of a PowerPoint to kind of introduce myself a little bit. And it's not just the content that I want to show you, it's also a little bit of the process that I'd like to role model for you in terms of what I think about when I think about social justice and higher education. So I will share it. Okay. That what I have for you is really what I want to do is just kind of quickly introduce myself. And there's a purpose for that I'm taking time to give a bio of who I am, because one of the things that I realized throughout my schooling, actually, all these years, has been that people don't tend to introduce themselves in terms of who they are. And so as a student, I remember taking classes and having these amazing, brilliant speakers and being like, but why you? Like, who are you? And they would be awesome, obviously, because, they were hand selected and hand picked. And ultimately later on, I would read these amazing things from them, realize, oh my gosh, I've heard this person speak before. But I think it speaks to the importance of really positioning myself. And I do this with all the classes I teach too, is that I give a little bit of info about myself, because I think what that speaks to also in higher education is this level of humility and bias that I want people to have when they meet me, to know that I am a person and I come from somewhere and I have biases and I have privileges and I've had my own experience of oppression, but I have a worldview. Sorry. I have a worldview and I am not neutral. I mean, you need to know that, because the expectation, the assumption often is that education is neutral, that it is an equalizer, that it will bring justice, right? That if we are educated, then we may have more social economic mobility. And that is actually not true. And I know that. We know that from data in terms of how much people with PhDs make. We don't make that much money, right? So really then it's like, wait, so you go to school for a long time, but that doesn't actually pay off then in terms of your economic social mobility or even respect, right? Or status. And so the point today really is that education is not neutral. It's biased, actually. And the problem is that it upholds white supremacy, and that we not only uphold it, we promote it. We require the students who come in to accommodate to spaces of whiteness and of white supremacy, and then to perpetrate it. And so I'll talk more about that too. But to before I get to that, I want to first introduce myself so you know who I am, because I want you to be able to critique me. I want you to listen to what I have to say and be like, no, I don't agree with her. And that's totally okay. And that's, I think, how education should be, that we're able to disagree and then be able to talk about why, that we're able to have difficult dialogues together and then figure out what's difficult about it. And then, so how do we move through together? Is it compromisable? Is it not? What parts are about our values and what parts are more logistics? And so a little bit about me that you already know about, right, is that I'm an immigrant. I identify as Taiwanese and Chinese, which outside of the US or the non-Asian context makes no difference if I just say I'm Asian American, but there's a lot of political stuff between Chinese and Taiwanese identifiers, political context. So saying I'm Asian American, actually, I think it's kind of what Lionel is saying. It's like, what does race mean? What does it mean to be Asian American? It's actually fictitious. It only is relevant here in this country. Nobody else identifies as Asian American and in other spaces, in other countries. My pronouns are she and her. I think Stephen did an amazing job introducing me in terms of who I am, my background. But I also, this is where I come from in terms of, me growing up, being an immigrant and growing up in LA. That I immigrated from Taipei, Taiwan, flew to the US when I was 6. And then I grew up in LA, and I have, on this I guess slide, right, where I come from, because I think this is where, if you know where I come from, my worldview is contextualized from here. And so if you're from somewhere else, or if you have a different perspective, then then we're going to differ, and that's okay. But you know where my blind spots are too. Don't just take my word for what it is, right? It is not the word. It is my word, with my biases too. And so a little bit about me is that I am an immigrant. I am from I'm a child of immigrants as well. And so, of course, growing up in a predominantly Asian community, I was immersed with other Chinese Americans, Korean Americans, Latinos. And so for me, I really wanted to go to college and to learn about, people's experiences that are similar to mine. I was really aware of the privileges of being Asian American, as well as the challenges and of the ways in which people outside of the Asian community did not see that we struggled, did not see about kind of Asian gangs that we had, that we had a lot of problems that if you were not Asian, you would think, oh, but this group is a model minority, they've made it, and would be really exploiting our Asian community to further justify racism and especially anti-Blackness, right? And so I went to college. Smith College in Massachusetts was all women's college. I really got my feminism on there in terms of thinking about my gender identity, about sexual orientation. I learned acculturation there for the first time, and I had language for the first time of what it means to culturally adapt and what my family's gone through, what my friends have gone through, why some of us struggle more than others, which then made me think, this is what I want to study. I want to study immigrant and refugee mental health. So you would be surprised by this, but I went to Lincoln, Nebraska to do that, right? Where I specialized in immigrant refugee mental health, and people would joke and be like, you went to the middle of nowhere to study people of color? Like, why didn't you go back to LA? Not knowing that Lincoln, Nebraska is one of the largest refugee resettlement sites in the country. So I went there, got really, really good training and really trauma-informed training too, as well as methodological training on being a qualitative researcher, community-based researcher, right? If I was going to do people of color work, it really had to be qualitative, right? I was not going to get the quantitative sample size, the kind of rigor that that would be considered quote unquote gold standards in social science, right? In terms of how to study our communities. And so that's actually another critique that I'll have later in terms of what do we consider to be good science and legitimate science, and who are the people that we're basing off of as the norm when it comes to the kind of the best standards, right, for rigor. My clinical training, I did my pre-doc internship in Chicago because I wanted to work at a rotation opportunity where I would be able to serve survivors of political torture. And that just blew my mind. I can talk with this in greater detail later, just in terms of how it just pulled the rug out from underneath me, in terms of all the ways I've been trained to think about therapy and clinical work, in terms of it has to be in this box, 50 minutes. But then when you work with communities then who have come from trauma in a way that's not the kind that you say, well, let's talk about your family of origin. What was your relationship like with your parents? That's not relevant when it comes to survivors of political torture. So some of these frameworks that we're trained in, psychodynamic, right, family of origin, Eurocentric frameworks did not apply to the work that I was doing. And it really shaped me in terms of my clinical identity. During this time, I also did a lot of racial justice dialogues, right, of what does it mean to have privilege, power, oppression? What does it mean to be white? What about white guilt? What about whiteness? And what about anti-Blackness? And so, being a counseling psychologist, having those skills, having these difficult dialogues all the time, really made me realize I really want to make a difference. And if I'm really going to make a difference in matters that have to do with people of color, I need to go where I would be able to do that. So I went to Mississippi. I took that as my first job in the Deep South. And people actually ask me, I'm so sorry you didn't get another job. Like, was there just like, what happened that you couldn't go anywhere else? I thought you were a pretty good student. And it isn't. I had options, but I chose to go to the Deep South. And it was good and bad, right? I learned so much from there. One of the things that I did learn, though, going there, was that I could not do my work anymore. There's no way I could study immigrant and refugee mental health there, because it just was not ethical in some ways. The community there was so small, so marginalized, actually, that the Asian American community, that the Asian American Center even, had funding for one staff member. So if I were to ask that staff member to help me with data collection, right? And if in the Deep South, where it was really poor, parts of the Deep South, if I were going to be conducting research studies like I did before and say, if you participate in this interview, if you complete the survey, then I'll give you $20. And if $20 is a lot, right, in a region where there's so much poverty, then it really is coercive, actually. People would have no choice but to feel like they have to participate. And that is what I did learn, because I did end up doing research in the Mississippi Delta, not with Asian American communities, but with the Black community, and learn of the ways in which different researchers from really prestigious universities would fly in for a summer or for a couple of weeks, collect data, and then leave. And community members knew that. They felt poached in that way. So they also knew, if you're going to come in and want all this stuff from us and then give us a gift card, we will tell you all the things you want to know. We will just say all the right things. So it was in a way a method to claim back the power, right? Because it was so insulting to have people coming into their backyard all the time, asking them questions, wanting them to change their lifestyles, doing pre and post surveys, and then taking that data and leaving. And so for me, I think that really then for me, leaving Mississippi was very hard, right? Mississippi was where my identity really shifted and evolved and expanded, where I no longer focused only on Asian American mental health. I really looked at healthcare access for African Americans, and really particularly focused on HIV because of my interest in intersectionality. And HIV is, it's one of the most fascinating from a scientific perspective, but also, I think painful diseases, and that it's one of the only diseases that we continue to criminalize. And that it is the intersection of sexual orientation. It is at the intersection of race in terms of it disproportionately affecting Black and Brown communities. That it is about the stigma. It's about religion. In terms of whether morally are you allowed to be engaging in these behaviors, and it is about all of these things that are so stigmatizing in one disease, right? And that. To this day, actually, we actually have prevention for HIV. Just, I don't know if y'all know this, but we do. You can actually take something as though it were like birth control, right? You regularly take, PrEP, for example, right? Pre-exposure prophylaxis. It could be oral, it could be an injection, whatever. And then you could actually prevent, right? HIV. People don't know this. Black communities still don't know this or have access to it or feel like it is accessible to them. So, for me, my work really expanded to HIV, and really, I note here, my research expanded to people of color health disparities. And I quote it as people of color health disparities, as opposed to ethnic racial health disparities, which usually is what we hear, because I really think the language needs to change too. It's really about the people of the global majority and our health disparities, right? That's what people of color are. Our health disparities that continue to persist, but that are not about our diet or our way of life. It's really about the ways in which racism hurts us, and then access to care hurts us. So that's a little bit about who I am, where I've been. I'm now in the Bay Area, right? So my last little marker is near the San Francisco area. That's where I am now. Leaving Mississippi was one of the hardest things I've ever done professionally, because I felt like I betrayed my community and I left them because I could and they couldn't. So I've come here now where I am still trying to do research with African American communities because of the issues that I now find very close to my heart, along with doing work that I couldn't have done there, right? Back to Asian American immigrant refugee work, looking at things like Islamophobia, having the safety in some way. So talk about things that I otherwise didn't feel like I could as the only person there. And I think we'll talk about this a little bit more, but academia forces people of color to go to places where they are the quote unquote only lonely. I presented on this before, that there have been so many spaces where I've been the only person of color, the only Asian American, and it's an only lonely experience that many folks of color have in higher education, whether it's at the grad school level, at the college level, grad school level, and then later at the faculty level. And it goes up even higher when you become a dean or you're a provost or a president, whatever. If you're a person of color, you likely are the only one or two. And so the loneliness and the emotional and psychological toll that takes. Today, I think what we're going to talk about, I actually just posted this on my Instagram right before coming, 19 seconds ago, before I saved this PowerPoint, because I thought this was such a powerful visual and relevant to so many of the things that I am working on combating, but particularly in terms of higher education, that we think of higher education as a place, right, where we can learn, we can grow, right? We are equipped with skills and resources, and will develop the kind of credential or legitimacy to be able to go out there, right? And be able to be promoted in this way, right? To make money, to be economically and socially mobile, that there will be justice. And I know that many universities are really invested in diversity and equity and inclusion. And you can even see in equity here that some universities are really trying to even actively put in resources for communities that have been historically and continuously are underrepresented and marginalized. That's good. That's not enough, though. The question, though, is, are universities also doing things that contribute to justice in our society? I say society because if we are, if we're thinking about higher education institutions, we may be building equity, programs, right, for equity and scholarships and kind of just putting resources to promoting equity within our institution. But what are we doing in terms of taking away that fence, right? We might keep bringing in blocks for folks to be able to stand on and look over the fence. But what are universities doing in terms of taking down that fence? And are universities even doing anything in that way? And so I think that's what we're talking about today, because the reality is that they are not doing enough. And I think that's what we need to talk about. And I will end my presentation here with some information, and then we will talk more. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much. So I'm going to stop the recording now. But everyone, could you please, let's give a round of applause to our wonderful panelists. Thank you so much.